The night they sold my job before firing me, I stood behind the operations counter at Westbridge Performing Arts Center, holding a seating chart already corrected 3 times before doors. Colin Reddick, my fiancé, walked in with the calm smile he used whenever he had already decided something and needed me to pretend it was reasonable tonight. Beside him came Piper Delaney, Denver's polished event consultant, carrying a tablet like she had been invited to rescue a building she could not navigate alone. When Colin's screen tilted toward me, I saw Piper's agency listed under transition partner, and my stomach went quiet before my face knew how to move. The lobby buzzed behind them, and I understood this was not a visit. The show was sold out. Ushers were waiting for final notes, and 12 accessibility holds could not be touched, no matter which donor wanted better seats tonight. Piper leaned over my chart, studying restricted rows like brunch reservations, then smiled at Colin with the confidence of someone already spending my paycheck somewhere else. "Piper is here to observe the patron journey," Colin offered, soft enough for passing donors and sharp enough for me to understand the warning underneath. I looked again, saw donor names she had no legitimate reason to know, and understood this was not observation. It was a handoff wearing lipstick. She was not learning my work. She was being handed the pieces they thought looked simple enough to steal. I kept one hand on the seating chart because work gave me something solid while my fiancé handed my position to his affair in real time. Piper asked why premium seats were locked, and I explained they were held for mobility access and touring company adjustments, not decorative caution or outdated habit. Colin touched my elbow like we were still a couple in public, then murmured, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Piper pretended not to hear him, but I heard enough to know he was not asking for help. He was asking me to behave while they erased me in front of everyone who trusted my work in that lobby. Westbridge only looked elegant from the lobby, where donors saw marble floors, amber chandeliers, and volunteers smiling beside flower arrangements they thought explained everything. Behind that lobby was my room, a windowless operations office where every pretty evening became a stack of exceptions before anyone checked a coat. I managed seating releases, accessibility holds, late ticket blocks, subscription swaps, touring changes, usher assignments, and the quiet emergencies rich people called inconvenience every single night. If a patron in row C needed a wheelchair transfer, or a donor demanded a seat we could not release, the problem landed on me. Those details looked small until one wrong choice turned a calm lobby into apologies, refunds, and patrons asking who had been careless with their night. That night, while Piper hovered near the counter pretending curiosity was competence, I cleared 3 problems before the first glass of wine crossed the donor lounge. A touring manager needed aisle seats protected. Box office had mislabeled a subscription pair, and Grant Whitcomb was short 6 ushers because snow trapped his crew. Grant rubbed his forehead, saw Piper photographing my notes, and muttered that if I disappeared for 1 week, the place would learn prayer through Excel. I laughed once, but it stayed in my throat because Piper never asked why the notes existed or who got hurt when they disappeared. She only asked whether the whole thing could be simplified, as if every locked seat was just a messy habit waiting for her pretty dashboard. Simplified was the word people used when they wanted the outcome without respecting the labor that kept it clean, legal, and invisible for everyone. I moved the subscription pair without touching the mobility hold, reassigned 2 ushers to the south doors, and flagged the touring change before refunds started. Piper watched my hands more than my face, then typed into her tablet after I explained why locked seats were not truly unsold inventory. By the time the lobby settled, every problem she had witnessed had disappeared, which was exactly why people like Colin could pretend the room worked by itself. The modernization meeting happened in Marlene Briggs's glass office, where every uncomfortable decision looked cleaner because the mountains were visible behind it. Colin placed himself beside Marlene. Piper opened her tablet, and Dana Fielding folded her hands like process could make this smell less personal. Piper began with frictionless patron experience, then proposed releasing premium holds earlier, reducing lobby staff, and moving exceptions into one pretty dashboard. I listened until she described accessibility seats as flexible inventory, and the silence in my chest turned sharp enough to steady my voice. I laid my printed notes on the table, one email at a time, because opinion would have made it too easy for them to dismiss me. The touring company rider required protected aisles, Grant's memo documented south door crowding, and box office records showed subscription swaps already strained opening nights. Those seats are not unsold. I kept my eyes on Marlene. They are protected because federal access rules and touring changes do not care about donor upgrades. Piper smiled without blinking, then said the current process felt emotionally attached to old habits. As if compliance were a scrapbook I refused to throw away. Marlene did not touch the emails, and that told me more than any speech about progress, because evidence only scares people who already chose convenience. Colin leaned forward before Marlene could answer, and I recognized the tone he used when he wanted a woman to sound unreasonable for speaking clearly. "This is exactly the resistance we expected," he said, while Dana looked down at a file she had already prepared before hearing me. I turned toward Piper's proposal and saw a phrase I had once explained to Colin at our kitchen counter. Subscriber disruption risk, typed under her agency header. That was when the meeting stopped being confusing, because they had not invited me to protect Westbridge. They had invited me to prove I would not cooperate with being replaced. Colin adjusted his cuff, Piper closed her tablet, and Dana finally wrote something down, which meant the decision had reached the paperwork stage before truth reached the table that afternoon, without me raising my voice once. Dana called me into HR the next afternoon, and the room felt arranged before I touched the chair across from her desk. Marlene sat near the window with her hands folded. Colin stood behind her like a witness, pretending he had not written the verdict. Piper was not officially there, but her proposal lay face down beside Dana's folder, close enough to make the performance honest. Dana opened with alignment, future needs, transition language, and office words people use when dirty work needs clean clothes. I let her finish because interrupting would have given Colin the reaction he had been waiting to call difficult. When Dana paused, I asked whether Westbridge was terminating my employment or requesting unpaid transition consulting after revoking my access. The question hit the room harder than anger would have, and Marlene looked at the folder instead of my face. Colin answered before Dana could, saying, "This tone is why leadership lost confidence," as if confidence had not disappeared when he handed my work to Piper. I asked for written confirmation of my final date, duties, and acknowledgement that I owed no support after credentials closed. Dana's pen slowed, because the clean exit she had prepared suddenly needed real language attached to real responsibility. Marlene tried to soften it with appreciation for my years of service, but I looked at Colin and kept my voice flat. "You did not appreciate my work," I answered. "You used it as a ladder for the woman you brought in behind my back." Nobody defended him, which told me the sentence had landed where their documents could not protect him. Dana slid the termination packet forward, and I signed only the receipt, not the version of events folded inside it. Security collected my badge at the lobby desk. System access closed before I reached the sidewalk, and my phone showed the confirmation email. They had not removed a bad attitude from Westbridge. They had removed the person who knew which warning mattered before the building paid for ignoring it. The first sold-out night without me started with a donor upgrade placed on top of a mobility hold I had protected for months. I was home, barefoot in my kitchen, when Grant's first text arrived with no greeting, only words that told me everything. "South lobby is bleeding," he wrote, and beneath it came a photo of patrons gathered around box office with tickets that could not be honored. I stared at the picture, saw Piper near the counter with her tablet lifted like a shield, and felt quiet not being responsible anymore. By the time curtain should have been 30 minutes away, subscription patrons had been moved into sponsor seats, and 2 aisle transfers were gone. Ushers were working from old notes. The touring manager wanted answers. And box office had started refunding people before Marlene approved the language. Piper tried to smile through it. But every question required exception judgment. Her dashboard had flattened into colored squares. Grant called Marlene from the lobby and made it plain enough. This is not a software issue. You removed the person who knew which exceptions were not optional. The line went silent after that, because truth sounds heavier when it arrives over noise. Colin texted first with the tone of a man still pretending authority was the same thing as access. "This is bigger than us. Maddie," he wrote, as if he had not made it smaller than decency when he brought Piper through my door. I read it beside the ring, then placed my phone face down without answering. A message followed from Piper, saying guests were being hurt and I needed to be professional, which was rich from a woman standing in notes she photographed but never understood. By intermission, patrons were posting complaints. A local arts reporter asked why accessibility seating was mishandled, and union crew timing had slipped behind schedule. Grant refused to sign the incident summary when Marlene tried to blame missing documentation, because my final email sat in her inbox with every warning attached. I did not celebrate any of it, because those guests had not wronged me. I watched confirmations arrive and understood Westbridge had met the cost of calling invisible labor replaceable. Marlene called after midnight, when Westbridge had run out of software errors, staff excuses, and polite ways to say the lobby had broken. Her voice sounded smaller without office windows behind it, and I could hear people moving around her like panic had become a department. "Maddie, we need you to stabilize the transition," she managed, careful with every word except the one that mattered. I looked at the confirmation email and answered, "You mean termination?" "Marlene, because transition is what people call a choice before it fails." She tried again, saying the board was concerned about patron confidence, donor relations, and continuity after reporters asked about accessibility seating. I asked whether she wanted help or record correction, because my credentials were closed. My badge was gone, and every warning sat unread in her inbox. Colin came onto the line before she could answer. His voice lowered into the intimate tone he used when he wanted damage cleaned quietly. "This is bigger than us. Maddie," he said, and I almost laughed because he had made it smaller than decency when he handed Piper my work. I kept my voice even because the ring on my counter had said enough for both of us. "The personal part started when you brought your affair into my department with donor access, and professional part failed when leadership chose her pitch over my documentation." No one spoke for several seconds, and I heard papers moving, probably the same emails nobody read before the lobby started eating excuses. Piper texted while I was on the call, asking me to be bigger for guests, and I deleted it. Marlene finally asked what I needed, and the question arrived too late to sound like respect. I told her further contact had to go through counsel, and Westbridge needed to preserve access logs, proposals, HR notes, and messages tied to my firing. Colin whispered my name like it belonged to him, but I ended the call before he could turn guilt into another assignment. The screen went dark, and nobody at Westbridge had a woman left to blame. My attorney's letter reached Westbridge before breakfast, and it did not ask for drama, sympathy, or a conference room apology. It asked them to preserve access logs, vendor proposals, HR notes, messages, and every email connected to my firing. By noon, the board stopped treating the collapse like customer service and started treating it like a timeline. That was the difference nobody in leadership wanted, because a timeline did not care who smiled better. Grant submitted his statement first, attaching the memo where he warned Marlene that reduced lobby staffing would break opening nights. Dana had to correct the HR record after my confirmation email showed the termination packet was prepared before the modernization meeting ended. Piper's proposal looked worse under review, Because subscriber disruption risk appeared under her agency header after Colin had heard me explain that phrase in our kitchen. When a board member asked how Piper obtained internal seating language without training or approval, Colin called it collaboration. And Grant answered, "That is not what collaboration means." The access logs did what nobody's tone could do, and they placed Colin's fingerprints exactly where his confidence had been hiding. He had shared donor seating notes, restricted section summaries, and internal exception language with Piper before I was accused of resisting change. Marlene tried to frame the failure as an unfortunate transition, but the complaints, refund records, and accessibility seating error made that word sound expensive. The board did not need anyone to cry, because the documents showed who ignored warnings, who copied my work, and buried a staffing decision under prettier vocabulary. By the end of the review, Westbridge suspended Piper's contract, removed Colin from patron strategy, and opened a compliance inquiry into my termination. Dana kept answering questions with careful sentences, but even careful sentences could not erase the order of events she had filed herself. I was not in the room when they read the timeline, and that absence mattered more than any speech I could have given. For once, the people who called my work difficult had to learn it from paper. Consequence. And the silence left where my job used to be. Westbridge survived, but it did not survive clean. Colin was removed from patron strategy before the season ended. Piper's contract vanished from the vendor portal, and Marlene retired with a statement so polished it felt frightened. Dana kept her job, but termination decisions no longer moved through her office without another signature. Grant was asked to rebuild front-of-house process with actual authority. And when he called to tell me, his voice carried the relief of a man finally being believed before the lobby burned again. I did not go back, because some doors close as punishment and some close quietly as mercy. A performing arts network in Santa Fe hired me to design audience operations across 3 venues. And this time, my name appeared in the system plan instead of someone else's pitch. My contract defined scope, access, escalation authority, and after-hours limits so clearly that nobody could confuse my competence with availability. The first evening, I turned my phone off. I sat at my kitchen table and waited for guilt to arrive, but only silence came. It felt strange at first, then clean. Like a room after everyone dishonest had finally left with the noise. I put Colin's ring in a small envelope with the written end of our engagement. Not because I needed a scene, but because I needed a receipt. He texted once, saying we should talk when things calm down. And I answered, "Things are calm now. Colin. That is the point." After that, I stopped saving men from the consequences they created and stopped calling exhaustion loyalty. Westbridge taught me the lesson in the ugliest possible way. But I kept the part worth keeping. I know how to build rooms that work. I just no longer build them for people who mistake my steady hands for something they could own ever again. Thank you for staying with this story. If any part of Maddie's life felt familiar, I hope you leave with peace, not bitterness. Choose the rooms that respect your name, your work, and your limits. And I'll meet you in the next story with something honest and human again tonight.